It was one of those chilly evenings in Vienna, when the air felt heavy with music and perfume. The grand ballroom glowed with golden light, crystal chandeliers shimmering above a crowd dressed in elegance. The guests whispered in excitement, waiting for the famous pianist to perform. Everyone there had come to see Leonard Voss, the man whose fingers could make even silence sound beautiful. At the back of the hall, away from the glittering crowd, sat a woman who looked like she didn't belong to this world of diamonds and champagne. Her name was Clara Jensen. She wore a simple gray dress and a soft shawl around her shoulders. While others chatted and laughed, Clara quietly folded her hands in her lap, watching the people around her. She hadn't planned to be there that evening. A friend from the library where she worked had an extra ticket and convinced her to come along. "You spend too much time with books, Clara," her friend had said. "You need a bit of music in your life." Clara had smiled politely, not wanting to disappoint. She liked music, of course. She always had. But something inside her had changed long ago. A part of her heart that once lived for music had gone quiet. Now she just watched from afar, clapping politely, keeping her distance from the piano that sat under the spotlight at the center of the stage. When Leonard Voss finally entered, the crowd broke into applause. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his dark hair brushed back. His confidence filled the room as easily as the sound of the orchestra behind him. He bowed deeply and smiled in that way famous people do. Warm, charming, practiced. He began to play, and at once the hall fell silent. Every note seemed alive, carrying stories and emotions that words could never express. The audience leaned forward in admiration, some closing their eyes to feel the music more deeply. Clara listened too. For a moment she forgot where she was. The way Leonard's fingers danced across the keys brought back old memories, of a small apartment filled with piano music, of laughter, of dreams that once belonged to her. She quickly blinked those memories away. This wasn't her world anymore. When the final note faded, the audience erupted in applause. Leonard stood, smiled, and bowed again. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes. Then, during a short break between performances, Leonard decided to entertain the crowd with something unexpected. He looked around the audience and said playfully, "Now who among you dares to try the piano? Let's see if we have a hidden talent here tonight." People laughed. A few hands went up jokingly. He scanned the crowd, his eyes searching for someone. Maybe someone ordinary, someone shy. That's when his gaze stopped at the back of the room. "You there," he said, pointing with a charming grin. "The lady in gray. Would you like to try?" Clara froze. For a moment she thought he must be pointing at someone else. People around her turned to look, smiling, nudging her playfully. "Go on," someone whispered. "It's just for fun." Clara shook her head, feeling her cheeks warm. "Oh, no. I couldn't possibly." But Leonard wouldn't let it go. He laughed lightly. "Come now, don't be shy. It's only a few notes. No one will judge you." The audience laughed along, thinking it was a harmless bit of humor. Leonard was known for his playful moments during concerts, a way to make people feel part of the show. Clara hesitated. Her heart pounded, not from fear of embarrassment, but from something deeper, an ache she didn't want to feel again. Still, all eyes were on her now. Refusing would only make things more awkward. With a small, nervous smile, she stood up. The audience applauded, cheering her on as she walked toward the stage. Her hands trembled slightly and her steps felt heavy, as if each one carried the weight of old memories. When she reached the piano, Leonard greeted her with a friendly nod. "What's your name, madam?" "Clara," she said softly. "Lovely name," Leonard replied. "All right, Clara, the stage is yours. Let's see what you can do." He stepped aside, folding his arms and smiling at the audience, clearly expecting a short, clumsy performance that everyone could laugh at kindly. Clara sat down at the bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and for a brief moment she didn't move. The soft lights glowed on her face, and she could hear her heartbeat louder than the whispers in the crowd. She hadn't touched a piano in years, decades, really. But somehow, sitting there, it felt like coming home. Her eyes softened as she looked at the ivory keys. They were the same as always, cold to the touch at first, waiting to come alive under human warmth. Leonard leaned toward the microphone. "Take your time," he said kindly. "Just a few notes, whatever you like." Clara nodded slightly. Then, without saying another word, she pressed the first key. The note hung in the air, clear, gentle, perfect. Something stirred in her chest. She pressed another, then another. Her fingers began to move more easily, following an invisible rhythm that had been asleep inside her for years. The audience grew quiet. The laughter faded. Even Leonard's smile slowly disappeared as he realized this wasn't going to be a joke after all. Clara's fingers moved gracefully, her posture straight, her expression calm, but full of feeling. She wasn't just playing notes. She was speaking through the piano, telling a story that came from somewhere deep within her. For the first time that evening, Leonard Voss, the great pianist, stood silently beside his own instrument, listening in awe. When Clara's fingers touched the keys, it was as if time itself stopped moving. The room that had been filled with laughter and chatter turned silent in an instant. Even the sound of the glasses being set down on tables seemed to fade away. Everyone's eyes were on the woman in the gray dress, sitting straight backed at the grand piano under the soft golden lights. At first, her hands moved slowly, like she was remembering something half forgotten. A simple melody flowed out, quiet, almost fragile, like the sound of raindrops on glass. The audience expected it to end after a few seconds, but the music began to grow stronger, richer, alive with emotion. The woman's hands moved faster, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. It was no longer a hesitant experiment. It was a conversation between her and the instrument. Leonard, who had started the whole thing as a light-hearted joke, stood to the side of the stage, arms crossed. At first, his smile remained polite. He had seen many people try to impress him, some doing surprisingly well. But within moments, that smile faded. The expression on his face changed to one of disbelief. He knew that sound and that flow, that emotion. This wasn't someone who had just learned to play a few tunes. This was the sound of a trained pianist, someone who had lived with the piano for years, someone who knew its heart. Clara didn't notice the audience anymore. Her eyes were half closed, her fingers moving without hesitation. The melody she played was a piece she had written herself many years ago, long before she had put music away. It was full of tenderness and sorrow, a song she had played for her husband when they were both young and full of dreams. As the music filled the room, the people listening began to feel something they couldn't explain. There was a story in the notes, one of love, loss, and quiet strength. Couples in the audience looked at each other and smiled softly. Some people even blinked back tears without knowing why. Leonard slowly walked closer, his expression serious now. He could see how her fingers moved, not just with precision, but with deep emotion. She wasn't performing to impress anyone. She was simply letting something out that had been locked away for too long. When she finished, the final note lingered in the air. Then there was silence, a deep, respectful, powerful silence. It lasted for a few seconds before the crowd erupted into applause. The sound echoed through the hall, louder than before as people rose to their feet. Clara looked startled. She hadn't expected that reaction. Her face flushed and she quickly stood from the bench as if she had done something wrong. She turned slightly, almost ready to leave the stage, but Leonard gently stepped forward and stopped her. "That was," he began, his voice softer than usual. "Extraordinary." Clara shook her head. "It was nothing. Just an old habit," she said, her voice almost trembling. Leonard smiled faintly, still trying to make sense of what he had just heard. "If that was nothing, then I've been wasting my life trying to play something." The audience laughed warmly at his remark, but he wasn't joking. He turned to them and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a true artist the applause she deserves." Another round of applause filled the hall. Some people even whistled. Cameras flashed again, though this time not for Leonard, for Clara. She stood awkwardly, unsure how to respond. She hadn't been on a stage in years. She felt like a visitor from another time who had accidentally walked into her old life. Leonard noticed her discomfort and gently guided her toward the edge of the stage. "Take a bow," he whispered with a kind smile. "You've earned it." She hesitated, then bowed slightly. The audience clapped again, and for the first time that night, Clara smiled, a small, humble smile that reached her eyes. As she stepped down from the stage, a few people called out compliments. "That was beautiful. You play like an angel. Who taught you?" Clara nodded politely, trying to make her way back to her seat. Her heart was still pounding. It all felt unreal. Leonard, still amazed, followed her down after a short while. During the next intermission, he found her standing near one of the side tables holding a glass of water. "Clara, was it?" he said gently. "I hope you don't mind me asking. Where did you learn to play like that?" She looked up, a little startled by his question. "A long time ago," she said. "It's been years since I last touched a piano." "Years?" He raised his eyebrows. "I wouldn't have believed that. You played with more soul than most professionals I've heard." Clara looked away, her expression soft but distant. "I used to play before life got in the way." Leonard nodded slowly. He didn't press for details, but something in her tone told him there was a story. Something heavy, something that still lingered in her heart. "I'm glad I made you play," he said sincerely. "I meant it as a joke, but I think tonight you gave all of us something special." Clara smiled faintly. "Sometimes life brings you back to things you thought you lost forever," she said quietly. Leonard watched her for a moment, sensing the depth behind her words. "If you ever decide to play again," he said with genuine respect, "I would be honored to share a stage with you." Clara almost laughed. "I think one stage is enough for me," she replied. He smiled back. "We'll see about that." The rest of the evening went on, but everyone kept talking about the woman who had stunned the crowd. People whispered to each other between songs, wondering who she really was. Some even thought Leonard had planned the whole thing as part of the show, but it wasn't planned. It was one of those rare, genuine moments that happen only once, when something real breaks through the glitter and noise. Clara's friend who had invited her found her after the event. "You never told me you could play like that," she said, eyes wide with admiration. Clara shook her head. "It's been so long. I didn't think I still could." "Well, you can," her friend said, taking her hands. "You made that whole place stop breathing. You should play again." Clara smiled gently. "Maybe someday. But for now, I'm just happy I remembered how it felt." As she walked out of the grand hall that night, the cold night air met her face, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel empty. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement, and the sound of music still echoed faintly in her ears. Inside her chest, something had shifted, something that had been locked away since the day her life had changed. She remembered the small studio she once had, the sheet music scattered on the floor, the laughter of her husband as he leaned over her shoulder to listen to her play. Those memories used to hurt, but tonight they felt different, softer, warmer. She walked slowly toward the tram stop, her shoes clicking against the stone path. For a brief moment she thought she heard someone call her name. She turned, but it was only the wind moving through the street. Behind her, inside the glowing hall, Leonard stood by the piano alone. He pressed one key and let it ring, remembering the sound of her playing. It wasn't just skill that had amazed him, and it was honesty, the kind that can't be taught. He looked toward the doors where Clara had disappeared minutes earlier and whispered to himself, "Who are you, really?" Outside, Clara boarded the tram and took a seat by the window. She rested her hands on her lap and looked at them, the same hands that had once carried her through every joy and every heartbreak. They were older now, but still steady, still capable. As the tram began to move, she smiled faintly. For the first time in years, she felt alive again. The next morning, Clara woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight streamed through her small kitchen window, touching the wooden table where she usually had her breakfast alone. The night before still felt like a dream. She kept replaying it in her mind. The lights, the applause, the sound of her own music filling that grand room. It felt unreal that she had actually played in front of so many people again, after all those years of silence. She made her tea slowly, her thoughts drifting. Every time she remembered the moment when her fingers touched the keys, her heart gave a small trembling flutter. When she went to the library later that morning, her co-worker and friend, the one who had invited her to the event, was waiting by the front desk. "There she is, our secret pianist," her friend said, grinning. Clara laughed softly, embarrassed. "Please don't start," she said, shaking her head. "Too late," her friend replied. "Half the city's talking about you. Didn't you see the paper?" Clara frowned. "The paper?" Her friend handed her a folded newspaper. There, on the culture section's front page, was a photo from the previous night. Clara sitting at the piano, her head slightly turned, the light shining on her face. The caption read, Unexpected star of the evening, unknown woman stuns audience at charity gala. Clara froze. She felt a strange mix of surprise and discomfort. "Oh no," she whispered. "I didn't want attention. It was just a joke. I wasn't supposed to." Her friend cut in gently. "Clara, you didn't do anything wrong. You reminded everyone what real music feels like. You should be proud." She smiled faintly. Proud maybe, but also nervous. The rest of the day passed quietly, though people kept whispering about her when they thought she couldn't hear. Some of the regular visitors even asked, "Are you the lady from the piano performance?" Clara would just smile shyly and change the topic. Later that evening, after the library closed, she sat at her small desk at home and found a message slipped under her door. It was a formal-looking envelope with a golden seal. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dear Clara, I hope this message finds you well. I haven't stopped thinking about your performance. Would you consider meeting me for coffee tomorrow? I'd love to speak with you about something important. Leonard Voss." She stared at the note for a long time. Her first instinct was to say no. She didn't want to be part of any spotlight again. But curiosity, and perhaps something else, made her hesitate. The next morning, she went to the cafe mentioned in the note. It was a small, cozy place near the Opera House. When she arrived, Leonard was already there, sitting by the window, sipping coffee. He stood up when he saw her, smiling warmly. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted. They both laughed lightly, and the tension melted a little. Leonard gestured for her to sit. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said. "You gave everyone a moment they'll never forget. I've been playing music all my life, but hearing you reminded me why I started." Clara looked down, stirring her coffee slowly. "It's strange," she said softly. "I stopped playing for so long. I thought that part of me was gone." "It's not gone," Leonard said gently. "It's still there, just waiting for you." She gave a small, uncertain smile. "It's not that simple." "I know," he replied. "But maybe it could be if you gave yourself the chance." They talked for nearly an hour. Leonard asked about her past, and she told him bits and pieces and how she had studied music when she was young, how she used to perform, how life had taken her in another direction after she lost someone close. She didn't go into detail, but he understood. After a long pause, Leonard said, "I'm organizing a charity concert next month. Something smaller, more personal. I'd like you to play with me. Just one piece." Clara looked at him in disbelief. "Me? No, I couldn't possibly. I'm not ready for that." He smiled patiently. "You're more than ready. The world saw that already." She shook her head, her voice almost a whisper. "It's not the audience I'm afraid of. It's the memories." Leonard nodded slowly. "Music has a way of bringing back everything, the good and the painful. But maybe it's time to face it, not run from it." His words lingered in her mind long after she left the cafe. She walked home through the quiet streets, her thoughts swirling. She didn't know if she could do it again. Playing at that gala had been an accident, something that happened without planning, like a spark. But a concert? That was different. Still, that night she found herself sitting at her small upright piano in the corner of her living room. It was old, slightly out of tune, but still familiar. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling a little. She took a deep breath and pressed one note. Then another. Slowly, the music began to come back. She played quietly for hours, not noticing how much time had passed. Each note seemed to lift a bit of the weight that had been sitting on her heart for years. She remembered her husband's laughter, their small apartment, the afternoons they spent making music together before the accident. The memories hurt, but they also warmed her. When she finally stopped, she realized her cheeks were wet with tears. But she was smiling. The next day she wrote a short note and sent it to Leonard. "I'll think about it. No promises yet, Clara." A few days later he replied with just one sentence. "That's all I ask." Weeks passed and Clara kept playing in the evenings after work. At first her hands felt stiff, but soon they began to move with the same grace they once had. Music filled her home again, and even her neighbors sometimes stopped to listen outside her window. She still told herself it was just practice, that she wasn't really preparing for anything. But deep down she knew she was. One evening Leonard called her. "How's the thinking going?" he asked with a smile in his voice. Clara laughed softly. "Dangerously close to saying yes," she said. "That's good enough for me," he replied. "I'll send you the sheet music tomorrow." She rolled her eyes playfully. You don't take no for an answer, do you? Not when it comes to talent like yours, he said. When the music arrived, she opened the envelope and saw the title of the piece, River of Light. It was one of Leonard's own compositions, soft and emotional, with moments of both sadness and hope. As she read through it, she realized it was exactly the kind of song she would have written herself. Something inside her whispered that maybe this was meant to happen. Every night after that, she practiced quietly, patiently, often losing track of time. She didn't tell anyone, not even her friend at the library. It was something private, something just for her. And the more she played, the more she began to heal. The memories that once hurt began to feel like old friends she could finally talk to again. Her heart still ached sometimes, but the pain was softer now, shaped into music instead of silence. One night, as she finished playing, she looked at her reflection in the piano's glossy surface. Her hair had streaks of gray now, and there were fine lines around her eyes, but she looked alive. She whispered to herself, "Maybe it's time." A week later, she met Leonard again to rehearse. They practiced in a small concert hall, empty except for a few chairs and the soft glow of the stage lights. When she sat at the piano beside him, she felt nervous but also calm in a strange way. Leonard looked at her and said quietly, "Just play like you did that night. Play for yourself." She nodded. As they began, the sound of two pianos filled the room, his strong and confident, hers gentle and full of emotion. Together they created something beautiful, something honest. When they finished, there was silence. Then Leonard turned to her and said, "Now I know why I met you." Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. Maybe we both needed a reminder. The day of the concert came faster than Clara expected. Weeks of quiet practice, long evenings at the piano, and gentle encouragement from Leonard had led to this moment. She had told herself over and over that she wasn't nervous, that it was just another performance. But as she stood backstage, listening to the low hum of the audience finding their seats, her heart was pounding so loud she could feel it in her throat. The concert hall was smaller than the grand ballroom where she had first played, but it was still elegant. The walls glowed softly under the warm lights, and the stage looked almost magical with the two grand pianos sitting side by side. She peeked from behind the curtain and saw the audience settling in. It wasn't a huge crowd, maybe 200 people, but it felt like 1,000 to her. Leonard stood nearby, calm and collected as always. When he saw her fidgeting with her hands, he smiled and said, "Breathe, just like we practiced. You're ready." Clara nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly. "I haven't done this in years," she whispered. He gave her a reassuring look. "The music hasn't forgotten you, and neither have you forgotten it." When their names were announced, the applause began. Leonard stepped out first, waving to the audience with his usual charm. Clara followed slowly, her steps measured, her expression calm though her stomach fluttered with nerves. The lights felt bright on her face. She gave a polite nod to the audience, then sat down at the piano. The keys waited under her fingertips, familiar yet distant, like an old friend she hadn't seen in too long. Leonard nodded once, and the performance began. At first, she focused only on her breathing, one note then another. The sound of the two pianos blended together, filling the room with a soft, steady rhythm. Leonard played with his signature confidence, every movement smooth and controlled. Clara's playing, on the other hand, carried warmth, a quiet emotion that wrapped around each note. The piece, River of Light, told a story. It began gently, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a storm. Then it grew stronger, more emotional, full of longing and hope. As the melody deepened, Clara's nervousness began to fade. Her body relaxed, her eyes closed, and her fingers found their flow. She no longer thought about the people watching or the lights or even Leonard beside her. She just played. The audience could feel it, the difference between performance and feeling. Her music spoke to something inside everyone listening. It was honest, almost vulnerable, and that honesty drew them in. When they reached the final part of the piece, Leonard slowed the tempo, giving Clara space to carry the melody. The spotlight seemed to warm around her as her hands moved gracefully, the sound pure and haunting. As the last note faded into silence, the hall remained still for a few long seconds. Then slowly the audience rose to their feet. The applause grew louder and louder, echoing through the walls. Clara blinked, her eyes glistening with quiet disbelief. She looked at Leonard, who smiled at her like a proud mentor, or perhaps more like a friend who had just witnessed something beautiful. They stood together and bowed. The light sparkled above them, and for the first time in many years, Clara didn't feel like she was running from her past. She felt free. After the concert, people came to speak with them backstage. Some were fellow musicians, others longtime fans of Leonard, but everyone wanted to meet the woman who had touched their hearts with her playing. "You made me cry," one woman said softly, holding Clara's hand. "That song reminded me of my mother." "Thank you," Clara smiled gently. "Thank you for listening." Leonard stood nearby, watching with quiet pride. When the crowd thinned, he walked over and said, "I knew you'd do this. I just didn't realize how much it would move me too." She laughed softly, brushing a stray hair from her face. "I didn't think I'd even make it through the first minute." He shook his head. "You did more than make it through. You reminded everyone what music really is." That night, after the concert ended and the hall grew empty, Clara stayed behind for a moment. The crew had already started packing up and the lights were dimmed. She walked back to the piano, placing her hand on the smooth wooden surface. The air still held a faint echo of the music they had played. She sat down again and pressed a few quiet notes, just to feel them one more time. Each sound carried her memories of the past she had avoided and the present she had just rediscovered. Leonard returned from backstage, coat in hand. "Can't get enough, can you?" He teased gently. She smiled. "It's strange. I used to think I could live without this, but now I'm not so sure." He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe this is where you were always meant to be." Clara looked at him thoughtfully. "I'm not sure where I'm meant to be, but for now, this feels right." He didn't push her for an answer or make promises about the future. He just smiled and said, "Then that's enough for tonight." They walked out together into the cool night air. The streets were quiet and the stars hung low over the city. As they reached the corner, Leonard turned to her. "You know, people are already asking when we'll play together again." Clara chuckled softly. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." "Fair enough," he said, grinning. "But I'm not giving up easily." She shook her head with amusement. "You really don't know how to stop, do you?" "Not when I hear something worth chasing," he replied. They parted ways soon after, promising to stay in touch. But that night, as Clara walked home, something inside her felt lighter than it had in years. She passed the same quiet streets, the same cafe where they'd first met. But everything looked different, brighter. Somehow, when she reached her apartment, she left the lights off and went straight to her piano. She touched the keys softly, whispering, "Thank you." It wasn't to the piano itself, but to the music, to the life it had given back to her. Over the next few days, her life changed in small but meaningful ways. People from the concert sent her letters, expressing how deeply her performance had touched them. A local music school invited her to visit, to speak to students about the emotional side of playing. At first she hesitated. She didn't see herself as a teacher or an example for anyone, but eventually, she agreed. When she stood before the young students, their faces full of curiosity, she smiled gently and said, "Music isn't just about skill. It's about remembering who you are. Even when life gets hard, don't stop playing. Because sometimes the music saves you before you realize you need saving." The students clapped softly, and a few of them even cried. Afterward, as she walked out of the small classroom, Leonard called her again. "So, Professor Clara now?" He joked. She laughed. "Hardly. Just trying to give something back." "You already have," he said warmly. "But if you ever want to play again, the stage is waiting." There was a pause. Then Clara said, "Maybe I will. But not for fame or applause, just for the love of it." "That's the best reason of all," he replied. That evening, she sat by her window, looking out at the glowing city. She thought of her husband, the one who had once filled their home with laughter and music. She whispered softly, "I played again. You'd be proud." Somehow she felt as though he could hear her. The piano stood nearby, silent but alive. She walked over, lifted the cover, and began to play once more, quietly, peacefully, for herself. Outside, the night was calm. Inside, the sound of her music filled the air again. Not for an audience, not for a concert, but for the simple joy of feeling alive. And somewhere in that quiet melody, Clara found something she'd been missing for a long time: peace. Weeks passed since the concert that changed everything. Life began to return to its quiet rhythm again, but something inside Clara was no longer the same. The silence in her apartment wasn't empty anymore. It felt peaceful, like a song that didn't need to be finished to be beautiful. Every morning before heading to the library, she played a few notes on her piano. Nothing grand, just simple melodies to start the day. It became her new ritual, a small promise to herself that she would never let her music go silent again. People still recognized her sometimes. A stranger at the market would smile and say, "You're the pianist from that concert, aren't you?" She'd nod politely, still not quite used to the attention. Fame had never been her dream. All she ever wanted was to feel connected to music again. One afternoon, as she was stacking books at the library, she received a letter. The envelope was cream-colored, her name written neatly on the front. She recognized the handwriting right away. Leonard's. She opened it carefully. "Clara, I hope you've been well. I've been invited to perform at a special music festival next month. It's a celebration of artists who found their way back to music after years away. I can't think of anyone who deserves to be there more than you. If you're willing, I'd love for us to play together again and one final time. With respect, Leonard." Clara smiled softly as she read the letter again and again. She wasn't sure if she was ready for another stage, but there was something about his words that touched her deeply. Artists who found their way back. That night, she sat at her piano thinking. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp near the window. She ran her fingers across the keys, feeling their cool surface beneath her hands. She remembered the girl she once was, full of dreams and fire, playing for the joy of it. Then she remembered the years she had stopped, when life had taken too much from her, but now after all the pain, she was here again. Whole in a new way. By the time the sun rose, she had made her decision. She would play. When she told Leonard the next day, he sounded thrilled. "You've made my week," he said. "It'll be beautiful, I promise," and so they began to prepare. This time it wasn't about nerves or fear. It was about meaning. Every rehearsal felt natural, almost joyful. They didn't talk much while playing. They didn't need to. The music spoke for them. The day of the festival arrived on a cool spring afternoon. The venue was outdoors this time, a wide-open stage surrounded by trees and soft lights strung above. The scent of blooming flowers carried through the air, and the soft murmur of the crowd mixed with the distant sound of birds. Clara stood behind the stage, watching the audience gather. Families, students, old musicians, people from every walk of life. It didn't feel intimidating this time. It felt right. Leonard walked up beside her, holding 2 sheets of music. "I hope you're ready," he said with a grin. She smiled back. "I'm not nervous anymore." "Good," he said. "Because this isn't a performance. It's a thank you." "A thank you?" she asked. He nodded. "For the music that finds us when we're lost." When they stepped onto the stage, the applause greeted them like old friends. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in soft orange and pink hues. The stage lights flickered gently, casting a warm glow on the pianos waiting at the center. They began to play. The piece was different this time, a simple duet they had written together during their practice sessions. It was soft and emotional, full of warmth. The notes flowed like water, gentle but steady, carrying the audience through waves of feeling. Clara could feel the breeze moving across her face as she played. The world around her seemed to disappear, leaving only the sound of music and the rhythm of her heart. She glanced at Leonard once during the performance, and he smiled faintly, nodding. It was a moment of quiet understanding, no words needed. They both knew that this wasn't just another concert. It was a farewell to everything they had once feared, and a celebration of everything they had regained. When the final note ended, the audience was silent for a moment. Then came the applause, strong, heartfelt, endless. Clara stood and bowed, her eyes shining. After the performance, people came up to them with tears in their eyes. Some shared their own stories, about giving up on something they loved and wanting to start again. A young girl, maybe 12 or 13, approached Clara shyly with a notebook in her hands. "I've been learning piano," she said softly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not good enough. But when I saw you play today, I felt like maybe I shouldn't stop trying. Clara's heart warmed. She knelt down slightly and smiled. Don't ever stop, she said gently. Even when it feels hard. Music doesn't ask for perfection, it just asks for honesty. The girl nodded, her eyes shining with admiration. As the evening faded and the crowd began to leave, Leonard and Clara sat at the edge of the stage, their feet dangling above the grass. The festival lights twinkled around them, and the air was cool and quiet now. Leonard looked out at the empty chairs and said softly, You know, I've played for thousands of people around the world, but I don't think any concert will ever mean as much to me as this one. Clara turned to him, smiling. Why's that? Because this one was real, he said. No glamour, no pretending. Just two people remembering why they fell in love with music in the first place. She nodded. That's all it ever needed to be. They sat in silence for a while, watching the last few people leave, the soft hum of conversation fading into the night. Then Leonard said, Do you think you'll keep playing? Clara looked down at her hands and then at the piano. Yes, she said softly. But not for the world. For me, he smiled. That's the best answer I could hope for. A gentle wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of the music they had played. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in. She thought about how far she had come, from the quiet woman sitting alone at the back of a crowded gala, to the one standing on stage again, sharing her heart through music. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about rediscovery, about remembering that even when life takes away what we love most, it never truly disappears. It waits quietly inside us until the right moment brings it back to life. In the months that followed, Clara continued to play. She gave small performances at the local community center, sometimes for just a handful of people. She even started teaching a few students, including the young girl who had come up to her after the festival. Every note she played carried a piece of her journey, her pain, her healing. And every time she saw someone moved by her music, she felt grateful, not for the applause, but for the connection. Leonard visited often. Sometimes they played together. Other times they just talked over tea. They became close friends, bonded by the music that had brought them together. One afternoon, he told her he was planning to travel abroad for a while. New performances, new projects. I'll miss our sessions, he said. She smiled warmly. So will I, but I have a feeling we'll meet again, and maybe on another stage, maybe just over coffee. He laughed softly. I'll hold you to that. Before he left, he handed her a small box. Inside was a silver pendant shaped like a tiny piano key. So you don't forget, he said. She held it in her palm, touched by the gesture. I couldn't forget even if I tried. When he was gone, she placed the pendant on her piano, where it caught the morning light each day. Years later, when people spoke of that night at the charity gala, the moment when a world-famous pianist asked an ordinary woman to play, they still talked about the shock, the beauty, the way she changed the room with her music. But for Clara, it was never about that night alone. It was about everything that came after. The rediscovery, the peace, the reminder that passion doesn't fade with time. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, she would play the same song she had played that first night, the one that had made the whole world stop and listen. The notes still flowed from her hands as naturally as breathing. And when the last note hung in the air, she would smile softly and whisper, Thank you. Not to anyone in particular, but to life, to music, to the second chance she never expected to find. Because in the end, what began as a joke had become something far greater, a reminder to everyone who heard her story that true talent never fades. It only waits quietly for the courage to return.